And I do need to, just so to preface this, I am a bit behind on uploading these to the YouTube channel. So um, if it's taken a bit of time for anyone out there to see this video, it is all down to my slowness, but we'll get there. But anyway, Michelle was about to share something in relation to Jarrett. Yeah.
Yes, we had a strange moment, a strange and wonderful moment this week where we both attended the Global Arts and
Mm,
Humanities Discovery
on
Theme
Monday. Yeah.
Showcase. And I looked across the rotunda and I saw Jarrett in person. I was like, am I looking at this correctly? Because normally we see you on Zoom from DC. But you were there in person. It was amazing.
It's so funny. I was telling some of the other fellows there that since I'm living at home and very few of my friends from high school are in the area still, I see next to no one, like in person or not. I mean, I guess I see a little bit on Zoom. But the whole mask, like recognizing someone with a mask was such an exercise for me. So I told them, I was like, when Michelle was walking over, you looked with the mask like one of my really good friends' moms. And I was like, is Adina here right now? Because you were walking towards me with such purpose. I was like, this person knows me. But no, it was great. And I got to meet Anna as well. She was there and she came up as well. And we had the same, she was like, I had to double check the poster to make sure it was you.
And Anna Freeman.
Yes.
Oh, great. Oh, that's so
Mhm.
good. Yeah.
So, Jared, you were one of the students whose project was showcased at that event.
hmm Yeah, so I was a fellow the past year in their undergraduate society of fellows. So they funded one of my research projects last year. And then they built those beautiful posters that was the first time I had seen them, which was great to be able to showcase and kind of like inaugurate the next cycle of fellows, I think.
Yeah, it was a great display. Brienne Lejeune, who created the
Mhm.
posters, was telling me about the challenge, in Sullivan, because every single panel is of a different dimension.
Right.
Um, so
Oh my
she had
God.
to measure every single one and design, the posters accordingly.
Wow. No, but Brienne's amazing. She did, because she also did like all of our websites. We all have like individual sites and she just does amazing work.
Yeah, this is the design. I mean, just again for those in the future that want to see this. And luckily the panels are still up. So even though I missed the actual presentation on was it Monday or was it
Yeah.
Friday? Yeah,
Mhm.
on Monday, I get to kind of wander around and see them since my office is just next door to that. So
Mhm.
Yeah,
It was a great show.
yeah.
yeah.
We
So
did.
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
sorry.
yeah. No, go, Michelle. Go, go, go. I've got
Yeah,
nothing to
since
say.
we experienced the rotunda for the event, and then it kind of sparked an interest for the Andean ensemble to go test the acoustics in that space. So on Monday, following that event, we had our class and we played in the parking garage and in the rotunda. Parking garage by far has the best acoustics. And we even got somebody dropped a bill in our case. So
Nice.
it was very cute.
Mhm.
We all signed it and we're gonna put it up,
That's funny.
But and then Tobias Zuniga Shaw, who is Nora Zuniga Shaw's son, had access to the Sonic Arts recording studio. So this last Monday, just a few days ago, well, when did we do this? My gosh, no, on Wednesday. That's when we did this. On Wednesday, the members of the ensemble went in and recorded, with this amazing, it's a state of the art recording studio. So it was a really interesting experience, and I think it'll give us a lot to talk about at that intersection of traditional music and technology. Um, about the differences between participatory music making in person this semester, which is amazing, and then what happens when we transition to that technology to like a recording studio where we're recording individually or in small groups, and how that feels in terms of the way that we interact, as a group. So it'll be very interesting. And Tobias has experience with the Sonic Arts Ensemble, the laptop ensemble. And so I think he's planning to add some interesting distortions and technological sounds, you know, to our recording. So it should be, we'll be excited to see what the outcome is.
That's great.
So Michelle, when does that class end, the ensemble?
Like the end of the semester. I think it's on December 8th. Let me see. December 6th is the last class. Yeah. And we're trying to figure out like what are some options for an end of the semester performance.
Mm.
Typically we have, when we don't do like a performance on campus, we usually have a peña at my house and do a potluck. But under the circumstances and just vigilance about COVID, especially right before the holidays, we may need to find a different option that allows us to spread out a little bit more. So we're looking for a venue and a date and a time. But the students were excited, you know, to do that, to have that end of the semester performance. They've had opportunities to perform for low stakes audiences. Richard saw us perform at Haggerty. And I think it's been a really good exercise, you know, for everyone during the semester. A totally different listening experience, you know, as we play in a broader space, in a more separated sort of circle, or not a circle at all, which is typically our preferred format. And then playing through masks, you know, singing through masks and playing with shields, which really blocks sound. And then there were certain instruments that we simply couldn't bring out this semester because they project too much, you know, as we play them with overblown tones. So we've taken that opportunity to talk about all of those things, both in the context of our playing and also in the context of communities playing. You know, certain rituals have been suspended during the pandemic, others have continued, but with consequences, you know, for musicians and participants alike. So yeah, so very different listening sort of experience and playing experience this semester.
That's great. I was wondering if you minded me using a little bit of today's session just to talk, and I did this in the email, to talk a bit about the study abroad to Toronto in terms of listening. And, you know, I've been thinking a lot about, I guess, even like sound and music in exhibition spaces that kind of creates a kind of sense of intimacy. And especially in these kind of large-scale exhibitions. So the study abroad is to the Toronto Biennial of Art, and it's called Ways of Listening and Learning at the Toronto Biennial of Art. And so one thing I shared when I shared the email for today's session was a recent publication for the education program and the programs for the biennial from last time it was on in 2019. And there was one of their storytellers, and they call their docents their storytellers, Fan Wu, who wrote this piece for the publication, the e-publication called The Uncommon Community. And it just really kind of, we read it in my class this past Tuesday, and we're also thinking about, it made me think a lot about some of the methodological questions that were rising from the Pachasana workshop and these kinds of issues. So, yeah, I was just kind of interested in, you know, and maybe we could, you know, I don't have to talk just about this experience, but maybe how some of the kind of strategies that Fan describes might be employed in the collection or in other kind of mechanisms too. So maybe I could just you know, share my screen, just show you a little bit about the study abroad, and then share Fan's work. I mean, one of the things to share with Fan is he uses karaoke as an exhibitionary experience, as a learning experience. So, but yeah, I mean, maybe, yeah. So if we can, like, I'll do this quickly. I don't want to kind of take up too much time, but then we can think about listening, and then we can come back to this really interesting conversation about listening. So let me just, again, these are just a few brief slides. It's not a kind of info session. Um, but it's, here is the work of Maria Teresa Alves, who is our collaborator with the COVID report from Kay and Vera. And I must say as well that I sent her a message not about the report, but her partner, her life partner, Jimmy Durham, died on Wednesday. And Jimmy Durham is a very important artist, but also quite a controversial artist because of claims of Cherokee descent and a lot of indigenous themes in his work, but also not being claimed by the tribes or any of the recognized tribes. But in spite of all that, he was a really interesting artist and Maria Teresa's partner. So I just extended on behalf of us my sympathies for her. And I should have got the report to her earlier because now I'm feeling a little bit, it must be a very difficult time for her. But we can come back to that. But this is a really interesting work that was at the first Toronto Biennial, which was kind of reminding visitors of the course of a hidden river in this major park in kind of northern Toronto. And part of the listening and learning is about kind of uncovering as well. So this study abroad is going to take place in May next year. COVID and getting enrolled students dependent. And so much of the work in this course is also related to the work that we do in our Unlearning Hour and at Cachoeira Cuna. So a decolonial arts education course, Indigenous knowledges, environmental justice, histories of settler colonialism, and decolonial listening. Decolonial listening is a kind of an interesting subset, and Michelle knows all about this from Dylan Robinson's amazing book Hungry Listening, and also from the work of Candice Hopkins, who's one of the curators of the Toronto Biennial. Her and her partner Raven Chacon are kind of at the forefront of thinking about what decolonial listening is, as well as Rolando Vasquez, who also writes about decolonial listening. And so, we're just looking at one of the main issues is to think about environmental justice and the cityscape and the landscape and histories that take place there, and also the intersection of Indigenous and Black and diaspora residents in Toronto is a really important framework, as well as LGBTQ artists and participants. And we're kind of in collaboration with the Learning program, as well as kind of developing what they're calling their mobile arts curriculum as part of it. So it's a really it's going to be research focused. And I've had a lot of interest from graduate students, many of that have been part of this group, like Tamrin, for example, and Anna and others, about this. And it's an online course with then an on-site component. And we spend the online course kind of preparing for the biennial by looking at the biennial that's already passed, but we'll also look kind of self-referentially at Columbus and think about Toronto and Columbus. And just on cue, Peter has arrived at that moment when we're talking about Toronto and Columbus. Peter, I'm just going through some of the ideas for the study abroad, ways of listening and learning at the Toronto Biennial. And then we have an online component, and this is kind of interesting because we're going to be based not in Toronto itself, but in Mississauga. Or do you say Mississauga, Peter?
Mississauga. Yep.
Yeah,
like Mississippi, only AUGA.
Okay, Mississauga. Because one of the main venues is actually, so Mississauga is around about here on the map of the Toronto Purchase, which is on Etobicoke Creek, which is the only natural border of, except the shoreline, the only other natural border of the Toronto Purchase, and it's a really important Indigenous site for the Mississaugas of the Credit, and so we're staying in a little motel there and moving into Toronto throughout our trip there. But what it means is that we'll be working very specifically with this one location called the Small Arms Inspection Building, and we'll be able to kind of create educational and interactive projects in relation to this exhibition. And then I've just given a few links as well to the current website. There's statements on the new edition as well. And then I just wanted to, again, turn to their online program, and I'll just pull it up, which is called This Is Not an Archive. And I'm going to just go back to screen sharing. So this is their programs, and so these are essays that were written about the previous biennial at the kind of midpoint between the two, well, a little after the midpoint. And I just wanted to show this one, which I suggested as reading. And I was lucky enough to go on a storytelling tour with Fan Wu at the 2019 biennial. And he has a kind of I'd call it like a manifesto of what the uncommon community is. But I think it's really interesting for us on the Unlearning Hour, because there are some elements here that echo with what we do, which is kind of when you're doing this kind of gallery tour, you don't know who's going to who's going to show up, and you also kind of create community at the moment that you are in presence and in space together. And so this kind of idea, and look at the second one, the uncommon community is uncommon in the sense of being rare under a cultural regime that restricts value to having things in common. This is the basis of neoliberal capitalism, which asks you to collapse your identity into a commodity. Difference is difficult to countenance, so the uncommon community attempts to lay the groundwork of trust and curiosity to bring difference into the full light of consideration. So again, this kind of the potential for the uncommon community. And I'm really happy to see Anna joining us, because Anna attended a launch event for this. Hey Anna, I'm just showing everyone Fan Wu's uncommon community, and actually I just will go down to this one section, which and maybe I'll pass it over to you, Anna, in a little bit to tell you to share a bit about how you experienced this. But I just want to go to one element that I really loved when I did the tour with Fan. It's called the Sponsors Wall, where at the biennial you have the list of who sponsors the biennial, and he would stand in front of it like an artwork and ask us to think about it, not only artistically but the kind of interconnectedness with the enterprise and the economy that was happening there. And it was a really kind of challenging and experimental approach to things. And I think a lot about this at the university as well, kind of like, I can't but not think of who is sponsoring things, who is, Coca-Cola just made an announcement celebrating the investiture of our president. And so you get these moments as well. And then back to listening. This is Fan doing a bit of Katy Perry's Fireworks in the gallery, and this was in response to the work by Judy Chicago, which has all these kind of explosions of coloured smoke as well, and so it was a kind of inspiring moment. And maybe it's only 14 seconds. Let's at least hear what they were singing. There's a spark in you just gotta ignite the light and let it shine. Just hold the night like a fire. Didn't even get to the good point, but it's really really interesting to think about how he uses karaoke as well. Which, also, and he spoke about this, there's so much heaviness in the work that we do. There's so much death and grief and violence that Fan was also thinking about how to engage with young people, even children, on some of the themes of the exhibition. And especially when it comes to climate crisis, and how do you get from those really dark and difficult subjects to kind of joining together in song. And so, I think that was one really important element that he brought to that. I'll stop sharing here. I can put the link of this in the chat, but this is the link I shared beforehand. But I don't know if Anna wants to reflect on, her experience of being there at the launch.
Did you already talk about this a little bit?
About what?
Echoing. Sorry. About the Zoom. Why is it echoing? About the Zoom meetings.
I think it's on your side, Richard. If you mute when she's talking, I think it'll go away.
Oh, there we go. Okay. Yeah, so I joined this Zoom Uncommon Commons group with the Toronto Biennial. I was there a few weeks ago, and the host took us through these activities and asked us to imagine ourselves in the space that Richard just showed you, which my dad was also in as well at the Toronto Biennial. We were downtown in that historic car, there was some relationship with car manufacturing, that building, and downtown Toronto. Anyways, and we were asked to, thinking about this like informal setting that Michelle brings up a lot too, we were asked to come together as a group and curate the space and think, remember the art that we saw, remember the signage that we saw, think about our wayfinding through the space and curate it in a very, we have like endless resources and we can curate it in this different way. So my group just kind of played with the desire to bring outside noises inside the gallery space, think about the history of the gallery space, because it's not really meant for a gallery. And then what else in terms of the Judy Chicago and the fireworks piece, the piece shows all of these women, these different bodies in like this kind of desert-like setting with, I don't know what they're called, but you have like a smoke like baton, let's say. I'm not sure what they're called, but they're also used in protests as well. So anyways, we were asked to kind of like, bring out our desires of how we would curate in this space and what we'd bring to the table, and really just very experimental thinking. And yeah, it was fun. It was fun to kind of push the boundaries and think with the organizers, some of the Toronto Biennial organizers. So.
And there was karaoke in this session as well.
Yeah, Zoom karaoke, which was very interesting. I did not partake, but the host did mention that he said, everyone, this is what collective work is, right? Doing karaoke over Zoom, which no, not for me.
Do you want to use this space to practice, Anna?
No, I'm good.
So yeah, I was, it was, and I brought this into Fanwo's essay into my class on Tuesday, as I just said to the group, and yeah, I just think it was, methodologically, so many of the things that we learned last year, I just felt were being kind of employed there as well, in the museum, in the gallery space, and also this question of like, sound as a way into that space is really interesting. And I mean, maybe Michelle, sound was really important for the collection, right? For the open house. And yeah.
Yeah, so I think that those are things that we're exploring in our collection as well. And Anna, feel free to jump in here. Some of the more conventional ways that we've explored it is to actually bring audio recordings, so for example, digital storytelling or audio recordings of oral narratives along those lines. But other things that we've done, for instance, is bring in sort of music into the space as a way to awaken the artifacts. So that connection between music and either artifacts, art, nature, environment, that type of thing. So trying and we need to think about other ways that we can do this. Amanda Ripley also brought to something very important, which is that when students or visitors hear their own voice, within the first few minutes of entering the space, they're more likely to engage in conversation and ask questions later. So we've been experimenting with that as well. What else, Anna, in terms of the collection itself?
Well, one thing that I was doing with the artifacts from the Amazonian display was to bring in bird noises, which I'll put one in here so you can hear, because the Oropandola bird is this fascinating sound, which to me sounds like lasers. But I'll put it in here in a moment. But I think this discussion also goes back to what we talk about in Richard's class in relation to biennials and major exhibitions, but understanding that we're trying to activate the space. And what does it mean to activate the objects, which, also what we learn in the Andean and Amazonian curator working group is that the objects they have their sentient beings and they have their own ontology. And so how do we communicate? How do we interact? And just more so, I guess, like bring to their being into fold, in relation to other guests that perhaps don't see the objects in that way, in that light.
Yeah, those are all really good points, and it makes me think about how oral traditions are intertextual in their narrative and their storytelling through and through. So they incorporate elements not just of oral storytelling, but of performance and objects, different things like this, so a multivocal, multi-layered type of presentation in terms of telling a story, where certain characters or certain myths may be represented by way of an artifact, others are represented by way of a movement, others by a sound, and others incorporated into the actual narrative. So I think that all of those things respond to Indigenous sensibilities about forming a story, right? Like in this intertextual, intermodal, multimodal sort of way. The other interesting thing, as you're talking, Anna, is that when we think about practices in the cemeteries with the ancestors, so thinking about the ancestors are in Chaishupacha or Chuskupacha, which is the fourth world or the other world, right? Within the four pachas, time spaces of Andean cosmologies. And the way to communicate with the ancestors is through dreams, sound, and smells, right? So when people take food to the cemetery, I actually thought, because my host family, the father, was very skeptical about some of the practices, and the mother was very diligent about doing the practices of visiting the ancestors, not just once a year, right, but multiple times during the year are designated for this. And he started saying, well, we know that they can't eat, so I thought he was going to debunk the whole thing. And then he said, but they can smell, and so they're enjoying it by way of the smells. The other interesting thing is that it is not a solemn occasion at all. There are children playing, there are people talking in loud voices, layering, so kind of a cacophony of voices, where you hear people saying prayers at the same time, over the same site, but they're all saying different things, very personal things. There's a balloon salesman that's always there, so it's a very festive occasion. And this idea of noise, conversation, dialogue, music, is really integral to that type of interaction. So those are some elements that we might think about as we consider these art pieces and artifacts, some of them, right? Not all of them, but some of them sentient beings, that respond to our interaction.
I don't even find that all that unusual either, because the idea of offering a sacrifice, back to the early Hebrews offering a sacrifice of a lamb or a goat or something like that, and having the room filled with the essence of the animal. That it's funny because it seems that we've come full circle, the idea of like, well, the dead can't smell, but we've been involved in that sort of multi-sensory way of either making a sacrifice, offering a sacrifice, paying some respect to some being. And, I don't find, a lot of people would find that unusual. When we were in Peru, I went on a couple of days after Halloween, which is All Souls Day, to cemetery because I was invited by our interpreter. Hey, you want to go to a party? And I thought, sure. What's it like? And it was a raucous affair. It was it was not denominational. It was not a Catholic thing. It was celebrating, and it was quite the party.
Mm-hmm.
It really was.
Yeah.
There was lots of food and lots of senses, and it was fascinating.
Yeah, and in contrast, so the cemeteries are segregated, right? So they both maintain the moiety divisions within Indigenous communities, the upper and the lower, but they also are segregated in terms of Indigenous and mestizo, right? And so it'll be very, very raucous and festive and active, on the Indigenous side. And then on the mestizo side, you don't see hardly anyone. You see permanent markers that are supposed to commemorate that person, but not the practice, right? And what Indigenous people say is that because people don't visit their dead, they're difuntos, so we don't call them the dead because the souls are living, right? We call them difuntos or las almas, but because on the mestizo side they're not visited, they don't bring people food, things like that, that those souls are really dead, So the idea of sustaining life, and then also the consequences of the dead as members of the community, and what they can do if you don't pay attention to a dream or don't bring them food. They can cause cataclysmic weather events mainly, right? So yeah. So just lots of things to think about there, in terms of the practices that we bring in, and especially as we run into this ritual space, not just a practice space, but a ritual space. It gets a little bit tricky in terms of what we do and what we should understand and acknowledge, but not necessarily do ourselves. So there's a fine line, I think, there. Yeah, and then in terms of listening, in the spaces, we have a really unique opportunity, and Anna is coming tonight, to this invitation at Otterbein University, where they have an installation by Cadine Navarro that has to do with listening to seats. It's called It Sounds Like Love. And what they've invited us to do is to come and engage, interact. Like, they didn't ask us for a particular type of participation, but just to come experience the space. And for ensemble members, they invited a few of the ensemble members to just come and listen, engage, and imagine what a musical intervention might sound like in that space. So it's going to be a really interesting experience, I think, just in terms of not just listening to the space, but also imagining, sound in the space.
And Michelle, how does the artist, I'm sorry I can't be there tonight, but can you tell us more about the connection that was made with this exhibition? Because I guess I was expecting, when you were talking about it, that there was an Indigenous artist, but it's a non-Indigenous artist. But are there Indigenous methodologies or kind of cross frequencies that are kind of employed here?
Mhm. Yeah, I think that that's the idea. So
Okay.
the theme is has to do with climate change. And later in the spring, they will be inviting Kimmerer, so Robin Wall Kimmerer to come. So there is engagement with Indigenous artists, and they found out about our group, our Unlearning Hour, Katawide Kuna, and then also I think they found us through the music School of Music website, just to see what those potential points of collaboration might be. But they're interested in our approaches to indigenous epistemologies and decoloniality, unlearning, and also thinking new practices for museum exhibits and installations that sort of engage some of those different sensibilities. It doesn't have to be just indigenous. I think I think just different sensibilities that are break with the model of museum collections in general. So I think that that's kind of the thrust. One of the things that the organizer shared with me is his frustration and maybe existential crisis over the last several years about what difference does art make, right? So art not just as representation of some of the crises that are going on, but as part and parcel of a solution. Um, and sometimes feeling like, what does it mean to write a poem? How can this impact different outcomes as we face something, not just one crisis but multiple crises that require not just conceptual change but also structural change, right?
Yeah, and that's is that specific to climate crisis? Because I think that it's obviously there are related, and environmental justice kind of is at the intersection of thinking about racial and indigeneity debates within climate crisis debates, but that idea of what art can do and the frustration that this artist is describing, I presume that, I don't know if he identifies as an artist or not, this collaborator, is really kind of palpable. I remember several years ago I had some dialogues with an MFA student at OSU called Kelly Bornhoft, and for her all of her work was about how to kind of show the people that you love that climate change is real, especially those people who are in denial about it. And her whole, it was like a really kind of just, she was just determined that this was going to be the focus of her whole artistic agenda, which is make palpable climate realities to the closest people in her life that deny it. And she has I'll just show you one thing that she has. So this was her final MFA project, which she created. She picked up rocks from national parks and made copies of them, of these rocks, but then left where the rocks were. She went back and left these kind of metal, you can't really see what's written on there, but kind of these metal plaques that kind of had poetic but also engaging kind of climate change focused references to them about the shifting landscape. And so the idea that these plaques were kind of abandoned and left at the park for these parks to kind of be encountered, I guess, was really important for her. But also this kind of interesting tension of, you're not meant to take objects from the park, so there's this kind of interesting kind of switching of these objects, so of the rocks, and she talks about the different types of rocks. But yeah, that I definitely hear in the person you're describing, Michelle, that frustration. And now, just because we've had the climate summit in Glasgow, and there's been a lot of reporting on Indigenous groups, and I'm sure Jarrett must have connection, like reflections on Brazilian Indigenous groups that are, it's even more, it's the real kind of, sharp point of the wedge of all these crises coming together, the kind of the failures to listen at those moments. So I can really see the interconnection between environmental justice, indigeneity, and and listening that you're sharing. And so, yeah, Robin Kimmerer coming just makes sense in relation to this. I'll just put Kelly's name and a website so you can follow her work. She's a really great artist. She's now on the West Coast.
I like this idea of making palpable, and I think Anna, I think about the indigenous women potters, of the area of Puyo in Ecuadorian Amazon area, and their ability as strong visionary women has to do with being able to translate abstract concepts into material art. So those are the master potters, that can transfer like a vision into something palpable. So I'm thinking about that, and then I'm also thinking about ongoing discussions in our group about interdisciplinary forums or connections. So I think that with these crises and the intersection of multiple things in any given crisis, right, we are realizing, if we didn't realize before, that interdisciplinary approaches are absolutely essential. A single disciplinary approach cannot begin to address or solve any one of these situations. And art, as we're talking about these things, art is a really interesting space, for that interdisciplinary encounter, more so than the humanities, for example. No, more so than any other science fields. Art really provides like this very unique space for that type of discussion and collaboration. So we're still sort of working through like how interesting and why, in what ways is it salient in that capacity?
Sometimes where that occurs are at these biennial style event. I mean, like the Toronto Biennial is committed to environmental issues at the same time as having artists engage with them. And there's a work, a recent book called A Billion Anthropocenes, or A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, and they have a chapter called the Inhumanities, which is kind of like a critique of the Anthropocene. And because it's kind of centering a version of the human that is not the human that has been criticized by especially non-white, non-gender binary groups. And so I know that this book has been really influential for Candice Hopkins, one of the curators of the biennial. She mentions it in a lot of her online talks and things like that. And so there's that kind of interesting thinking that happens in that kind of space where artists are brought in relation to kind of certain curatorial and educational frameworks in exhibitions. And then the exhibition becomes a kind of space of thinking for this. And it may not be the same as academic interdisciplinarity, but it does constantly connect the arts with certain forms of thinking and disciplines beyond, especially the humanities, in doing that. So and also, what's happening at Otterbein is just another example of that, right? The gathering to talk around an exhibition just seems like a really important mechanism to break out of disciplinary borders and doing it through art. So, and I think, yeah, we've been committed to that as a group too with Cachawilla Kuna. So, but it's almost like sometimes there needs to be this kind of literal, like, where's the bibliography in relation to the artwork, right? Where's the follow-up? Where's the kind of, further reading, right? When you walk into an art space and then want to connect in ways, where is the where do you kind of go? And but you know, I mean, I think that you know, I think in your exhibition, in the collection, in the open house, that was, you know, if you take that as a model of exhibitionary expansion, then that shows, because there was lots of bibliography there, right? There was lots of take this to read more and engage more in this kind of thing.
And I think that what we tried to do is prompts, you know. So for instance, Anna, I'm thinking about the phrases in Aymara and in Quechua that Emily wrote alongside the anaconda, the chalk drawing of the anaconda. Those in themselves are, you know, suggestions about where else to look, you know, how else to understand the work. And then, of course, the activities themselves. So the hands-on activities are also those types of prompts. So we always talk about how we raise more questions than provide any answers. And ultimately, I think that is a really good way to go about it, because even at a quick glance, Fan's article on uncommon communities it kind of points us to that, right? Like that the minute that we label something, you know, the minute that we categorize it somehow, you know, it loses its mobility, and that's a real problem, you know, from Indigenous perspectives and from any perspective, really, you know. So the idea of asking questions that lead to more questions, not necessarily answers, ultimately is a strategy, right? Like that getting to an answer or an outcome isn't necessarily the objective, right? It's just to continue to keep talking, to keep dialoguing. And my dissertation was actually called Rimarishpa Kausanchik, right? So it means talking, we live. And sort of explaining that even asking for basic directions, that people will not give them to you, even if it's like, go straight and take a right, you know, and then you'll be there. Because any conversation is an opportunity to dialogue and continue dialoguing. And so even something that has an answer, people will not give you an answer, but just sort of continue talking. Then they'll walk with you. Then they'll take the alternate route. You know, as long as the dialogue keeps going.
A kind of case study that this conversation has reminded me of a bit, especially with regard to the like interdisciplinarity, is looking at Warao Indigenous people in Venezuela. I've done some work on their migration into Brazil amidst the crisis in the past couple of years. And one of the most fascinating things is that the Warao people, they lived at one point, they're being obviously displaced over several decades, but along the delta of this one river that crosses through Venezuela, and there's this tree that grows there that in Brazil they call burichi, in Venezuela I think they call moriche, but for the Warao people they call it like the tree of life, because you can get almost anything from this tree. That you can make food out of it, you can use the fiber to build homes and build different products and whatnot. What's really interesting is now, as there's kind of flowing into Brazil, they sell craft items made from that fiber in order to gain livelihood and whatnot. And a lot of people look at them as these cutesy, touristy type, like artsy craft items that they can buy. And I think there's just so many different ways to look at it from so many different disciplines. Like at once you can look at it as the commodification of Indigenous products and Indigenous livelihoods, because that is sort of like the base purpose of it. You can also look at like different environmental considerations, because the fact that tree is protected by the state of Roraima in Brazil, it makes it really difficult for them to get the fiber, and then they have to get it imported. It's less quality, like all of these different considerations. It's super fascinating. And I think that in this space, I hadn't really thought as much about more of the art question and what types of questions are answered, or as you were saying, Michelle, what kind of questions are generated further through looking at it from that lens. But that's just something that came to mind. I can share some resources about like further reading, but that's just something that came to mind.
This is fascinating, Jared. I'll definitely look at this resource that you're posting, because in the Otavalan area, there's also a tree. It's a lechero, you know, which is a tree that produces like a milky sap that's used for medicinal purposes, but it can also, if given in the wrong doses, can kill you, right? It's planted as a fence, you know, because it continues growing no matter what. But it's also known as like the tree of life, and in a way, people deliberately like will chop off like a little branch, and then you just stick it in the ground, and this like rich volcanic soil, it just grows back. But the idea of creating crafts, you know, out of the tree, and then putting those in different people's homes, and that traveling internationally, you know, to different tourist homes. Um, Ultimately transplants a little bit of the sacred into the daily sort of existence of people. So it's kind of an interesting idea, no? Just to sort of think about how that might work.
The mention of trees, you know, this is obviously the biggest topic in the world, but in the Global Indigenous Arts Education for Settlers class, one of the students, I think it was Amanda, that brought the writer Leanne Betsmasaki Simpson and her new book Nupamin, and there's this amazing correspondence between one of the characters and a tree, and this idea of the kind of mundane brought into the kind of like spiritual. I'm just going to share this one passage. It's just hilarious. I mean, not hilarious, but just it's really kind of just engaging. It's like it's this character in the tree watching the Tour de France cycling competition, and if I just pull up a little bit, yeah, just starting here. Akawenzi is sitting at the bottom of Ninatig watching the Tour de France on their phone. If you were to ask them, Akawenzi would tell you that they and the tree are watching it together, and maybe that is true. There is a love between these two. I asked Akawenzi why the Tour and why the tree, and they answer, because it's funny. Why? Because of the way the announcer says cobbles, because these are a bunch of white men racing around with metal contraptions between their legs for no reasons. Because Ninatig wants to know what is going on in the world, because Ninatig likes that they get up after the crashes. Trees can't do that. Akawenzi says that old trees like Ninatig can suck the sad out of you and heal you if you hug them. Heal you meaning take the edge off, I think. I ask about consent. I would hate if I was stuck in the ground and people just came up to me and hugged me without asking, demanding I suck the hurt out of them. Akawenzi shakes their head. Ninatig only sucks it if they want to. They don't suck for everyone. And what makes you think Ninatig is stuck? Ninatig is Akawenzi's oldest friend. They have been hanging out long before watching the Tour de France was a thing. Akawenzi met Ninatig as a toddler. They were wandering around in the bush one day, and Akawenzi was just drawn to Ninatig. Every time their parents took them for a walk, the toddler sought out Ninatig like other kids seek out candy. That's how it was for all of Akawenzi's life. They just sought Ninatig out. They just kept on visiting through the teen years, the band years, the poet years, the chief years, the breakup years, and now the old age years. They just keep on visiting. Akawenzi brings Mindamoyan to Ninatig more than once, but it never clicks for them. Mindamoyan can't relax into the connection, and although Ninatig tries, these things can't be forced. I mean, that's the tree in life, I guess, the tree of life, the tree the trees in our lives, you know.
Yeah, I love the perspective, right, of the tree and what's fascinating and funny, you know, from that perspective. It's really refreshing, you know, to hear that. Another aspect that we see in Andean cosmologies and Amazonian cosmologies is transmogrification, right? So like shape shifting, where the essence of something is what is permanent, but the shape is not, right? The form is not. And so we have many myths, you know, that talk about multiple transformations, you know, whether it's from people into trees, into stones, into mountains, you know, different things like that.
I'm so glad that you made that point, because one of the other things that I was going to say with regard to Warao migrants is that oftentimes, because of different issues of precarity when they move to Brazil, they beg for money in the streets, especially women with their children. And a lot of people have been expressing a lot of concerns with that. They're like, oh my gosh, this is so XYZ adjective to describe the precarity of that. But what's really interesting is that a lot of the anthropologists and Indigenous advocates have been pushing back, because they say that what our livelihood has always been based on the use of the Burichi tree that I mentioned and the craft making and whatnot, but also on like almost like hunting and gathering, or just the gathering aspect. So they see begging as a form of gathering. They're just gathering, you know, some coins instead of some berries or anything from the tree. So I think that it was really interesting what you were saying, Michelle, about like the transformative power and the ways of kind of rethinking these things. Like it's not seen as a shameful thing, probably because the reason that they're begging is because of like colonial violence against them. So they're not embarrassed to do that. It's a form of livelihood, and it's a transformation of something that they used to do but have had to adapt to different conditions.
Yeah, this is fascinating. You know, there's I love that, you know, transition and sort of like as a form of adaptation, right, to new circumstances. There's a different interpretation in the communities where I work, you know, so coming back full circle to visiting the ancestors, where again, the father in the household that I was staying in said that I was asking, why do people leave the food then, you know, like on the graves? And he said, oh, that's for poor mestizo children and stray dogs to eat. So more and more, you know, and just thinking about appreciative inquiry approaches, where the communities that I work in don't consider themselves impoverished. You know, they see themselves as very rich in many, many different things, not economically necessarily, but in a wealth of knowledge, wealth of resources, access to the land, knowledge about how to take care of the land and provide food, things like that. And they see that mestizos are tied to a wage. When there are economic fluxes, you feel it right away, you know, on the family dinner table. So this perspective of the world toward indigenous communities or minority communities is somehow disadvantaged and poor, even with the best intentions of helping, still define them that way and look at them that way. And in the meantime, indigenous communities don't see themselves like that at all. And it doesn't mean that they're ignoring like economic disparities that happen within the communities themselves, but still the perspective is very different. So yeah, in the case where I work, it's mestizo people who beg, and indigenous people don't, you know, as a concept, not necessarily as a practice. But yeah, this is really fascinating.
Well, to be the voice of timekeeping, we are at the end of our hour. There is, just in case anyone's available, at 4 o'clock today, I know that there's a talk by an Indigenous, I think Two-Spirit comic artist with the Billy Island as well. I was trying to pull up the information. And then that just reminded me that they have an exhibition right now called Power Lines about comics and the environment. And there's a really interesting Indigenous artist that's part of that exhibition. And this is their Instagram post. This is Wesho Alvitre, Alvitre, and talks about the exhibition. There's also a land acknowledgement as part of that exhibition that Jared Gardner curated as well. And also they've also accessed some of Weshoyot's work into the Billy Island connection. So really interesting to think about, you know, those kinds of intersections there. I can put this link to their Instagram into the account, but yeah, you can maybe visit that exhibition, and Jarrett, when you're back in town, you can visit that too, and to continue this like very broad conversation that's got us from listening to environment to listening to and with the environment to so many other topics, just like we usually do. We've gone around the houses and beyond in our hour together. Okay, everyone. No, we won't meet next week because of the colonial holiday. So I am meeting my Scottish family that moved to this country from the 1950s for Thanksgiving, and so I'm taking off my anti-colonial hat to celebrate the holiday as a as a settler colonizer. But we'll be back the following week after that. But I hope you all have a wonderful holiday and however you celebrate it. And once again, thank you for sharing space. Bye.
Take care, everyone. Have a nice holiday. And Peter, I hope you have an enjoyable visit to Columbus and time
Of
with
course.
Hannah.
I'm very much looking forward to it. I can hardly wait to get down there.
That's
so I
good.
leave Tuesday night and cooking a turkey on Thursday, I think, for 4 or 5 people. So yes.
Right. That is
Enjoy.
great.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye-bye.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
Happy Thanksgiving. Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.